Hello and welcome to Ask DW on YouTube. I'm Phil Gale and this is a show where your questions take centre stage. Today it's all about the recent death of Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash and how this is likely to impact Iran and the Middle East. Standing by to take your questions and comments in a couple of minutes is Kamran Mateen. He's a senior lecturer in international politics at the University of Sussex in the UK. Well, huge crowds gathered in Tehran today for President Raisi's funeral procession. Along with Iran's foreign minister, he and several others were killed on Sunday in a helicopter crash near the border with Azerbaijan. The Iranian army says it's investigating the incident. State media reported a technical failure was to blame for the crash.
A state funeral heavy with symbolism. The black turban atop of President Ebrahim Raisi's coffin, marking him as a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad and a righteous bearer of power. Millions of mourners reportedly turned out, not all of them by choice, with some Tehran residents saying they received phone messages urging them to join the funeral procession. To many Iranians, Raisi will be remembered as the Butcher of Tehran, a member of the so-called death panel, which sent thousands of political prisoners to their death decades ago. And more recently, as the leader who oversaw the brutal repression of women and a freedom movement that swept the country.
It's the fact that he was associated with a lot of crackdowns with execution of the Iranian oppositions in the 80s when he was a public prosecutor in Iran, and the fact that he was very close to the supreme leader, really, that didn't help his case. So I don't think there is a widespread sense of grief.
The funeral also provided a glimpse of Ismail Haniyeh, widely regarded as the highest official in Hamas, the Palestinian militant group that Iran has funded and armed during its war with Israel. Experts say Tehran's influence in the region will not be affected by the death of its president.
I very much doubt that the Iranian regime will change course given the advanced level of its nuclear program, which it sees as a bargaining kind of chip in negotiations with the West. With the reformists completely out of the system, the regime by definition has shifted to the kind of right.
Ebrahim Raisi was widely seen as a potential successor to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. No matter who succeeds him, it seems unlikely they'll change the course of the nation, led by religious hardliners.
So that's where we are for the next half hour or so, looking at the implications of the death of Iran's former president. You saw him in that report. He joins us now, Kamran Mateen, who lectures in international politics at the University of Sussex. Questions in this edition of Ask DW, just pop them in the comments. And from you to us. OK. So, Kamran Mateen, welcome back to DW. Let's start with the funeral. Lots of people.
Thank you.
Massive crowds there attending today's procession. How much of this do we believe to be genuine sympathy and how much staged?
Good evening. Thanks for having me. Well, I mean, I grew up in Iran and I went to school and university in Iran in 80s and early 90s. And my experience was that, students were forced actually to attend these staged ceremonies. If you didn't, you would be reprimanded. Even your ability to go to university later on was compromised because people were actually vetted by special commissions to be approved for actually even being able to study at university. So things might have changed in that regard a little bit, but I don't think the basic principle has changed, that Iranian state uses its power, and especially its state employees, people in the public sector, are forced to attend these ceremonies. And in addition to that, I mean, if you look at X, former Twitter, other social media outlets, you will see that many Iranian users actually use different methods to show the way in which Iranian state TV actually exaggerates the number of people attending. And in many cases, several thousand people are, represented as if there are tens of thousands of people. But in any case, I mean, Iran is more than 80 million population, and the regime definitely has a certain percentage of population, supporting it, around 10-15% at best estimates. So they should be able to, bring enough people to fill these squares and streets for such a day.
OK, so that gets us off nicely. Where next for Iran? That's what we're looking at over the next half hour with our special guest, Kamran Mateen. Get in touch in the comments, as Matthew has done. Matthew has asked, with the Iranian government dealing with Raisi's death, could we see a rise in anti-government protests like we saw with the anti-hijab protests?
These protests in Iran are not quite predictable, partly because there is no organized leadership. And this lack of organized leadership is both it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it makes, suppressing protest or suppressing dissent in Iran difficult over a long period of time. But it also means that it's more difficult to organize it in a strategic way to kind of strike the government when it is at its weak point, such as this current days. So it's not clear, whether there will be protests or not. The latest round of nationwide protests, which began in September 2022, following the state murder, I would describe, of Jina Mahsa Amini, the Kurdish girl who was killed in Tehran, only was fully repressed last year. So people are still reeling from extremely violent repression of the security establishment during that period of protest. But we have to see what happens during the run-up to the elections, which must take place constitutionally within 50 days. And depending on how the state is going to organize these elections, if it allows potentially some level of competition, people might use those possibilities during the campaign to protest. But I'm not very optimistic that actually a regime will open up this stage for a healthy competition, even within establishment itself. That is to say, a competition between reformists and the so-called principalists, the two main factions within the Islamic Republic.
So when should we start getting indications as to what is likely, who the likely runners and riders are to be for the post of Iranian president? Do you expect a competition, or will there be a selection?
Well, there will be an election. Constitutionally, the election has to be held. But the issue is that in Iran, even though the system on paper is a Republican political system, but there are unelected bodies, most important of which is a body called the Council of Guardians, a 12-members body whose members are appointed by the supreme leader. And this body basically vets every single candidate for any office in the country. So in that sense, candidates are selected beforehand, so only people can stand in the elections which are pre-approved by the system itself. In that sense, the competition is very much engineered and controlled. In the past decades, up to 5-6 years ago, when moderate figures or reformists were able to take part in elections, you could see some sort of competition within a system which is, academically described as competitive authoritarianism. But since the time Raisi actually won elections, reformists were completely excluded from the system, from the political system, as even the moderate principalists such as Rouhani, the ex-president who oversaw the nuclear negotiations and the Iran nuclear deal, were actually disqualified from participating in parliamentary elections as well as presidential elections. So we have to see whether, who is allowed even to stand for the elections. The current, or rather the former Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a former general in IRGC, Revolutionary Guards, is tipped as one of the potential candidates. He has extensive links within the establishment to the Supreme Leader and to Revolutionary Guards. But I'm sure there will be more than one candidate, so there has to be some semblance of competition during the election.
OK, so there will be a sort of a pre-selection process. But one of the things that I've heard said over the last few days about the death of the president is, well, it really doesn't matter because Ayatollah Khamenei is the big boss. He will decide what he wants. He will decide the country's direction. The president is merely his face, his presence amongst the politicians. So nothing really changes.
Well, there is a lot of truth to this observation because the Iranian constitution recognizes the office of supreme leader, which is currently Ayatollah Khamenei, having overarching power over all the other powers which supposedly should be independent, such as judiciary, legislative body, which is the parliament, the Iranian Majlis, and the presidency. So these bodies, including the presidency, have limited powers. And whenever the supreme leader decides, actually, he can override them. And it has used this power time and again in the history of Iran since the revolution 1979. And therefore, the constitution has become a battleground, both within the establishment, when the reformists wanted to fully implement it or even put it to a referendum to be amended and so on, and also the opposition, which sees the constitution as the basis of authoritarianism, which is basically sustained by brute force of the security and kind of military establishment. At times when you have had independent-minded presidents such as Khatami or to some extent Rouhani, who could use their limited power to negotiate and haggle with the supreme leader, you could see certain level of kind of differentiation politically within the state. But even that little semblance of competitive politics has gone over the last decade or so, and especially since the so-called Green Movement of 2009, which was brutally repressed by the Islamic Republic at the time.
So, in effect, Ayatollah Khamenei has absolute power.
He has absolute power, but he also needs a certain level of support, but especially within security and military establishment. And that base of power is IRGC. Khamenei, since his own accession to supreme leadership, has systematically cultivated relations with IRGC, supported them, and there is a huge amount of economic interest involved IRGC using the sanctions to create a parallel economy dominating more than 1/3 of Iranian economy, even more under they are owned or run by institutions which are directly or indirectly related to the supreme leader. So while he has enormous power, but he does also need some sort of negotiation with IRGC in particular, which has the military and economic power which is unrivaled in any state in the Middle East or beyond. But in the end of the day, yes, constitutionally, supreme leader has all the power in his hand, and he can, especially in major policies such as foreign policy, domestic and national security policy, he has the last say on these policies.
OK, Cameron Matin is our guest on Ask DW today. He lectures in international politics at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. In the next few minutes, we're looking at where next for Iran, given the death of President Raisi. If you have questions or comments, put them in the comments box here at DW's YouTube. A question that's come in for you. Let's talk about the power dynamics within the regime, because from outside it often seems as though, when we talk about the Iranian regime, it often seems as though they act as a bloc. So we'll talk about, the question is, who do you think is the most likely successor? And talk us through the power dynamics within the regime.
If the question of succession refers to the supreme leader, technically and according to the constitution, there is a body called Assembly of Experts, whose members are elected in elections. But as I mentioned earlier, the people who stand for elections to that body themselves are selected and have to be approved by the Council of Guardians, whose members are appointed by incumbent supreme leader. So only people get into that assembly who are approved by the leader himself, and those people are supposed to choose who is going to succeed him. So the talk in Iran has been for at least past 2 decades that Khamenei himself favors his own son, Mojtaba Khamenei, to succeed him. But there are also some concerns within the regime itself that this would give the impression of a hereditary system similar to the monarchy which Iranian revolution toppled.
So that's the supreme leader. But let's keep it to the president for now. And talk us through the power blocks. Who is vying behind the scenes to replace the former president?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the parliament, Iranian parliament's term ended recently. New parliament has been inaugurated, but a new speaker has not been selected or rather elected within the parliament. But the speaker for the last term of that parliament is a person called Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who has been the speaker of the parliament for some years, and he has a long history of association. He was a senior general within the IRGC, and he's seen to be close to Ayatollah Khamenei. So he is, the rumors have it that he will stand in these elections. He has stood for presidential elections in the past. He has never actually gained any considerable number of votes in the elections, but he might try his luck this time as well. There is another former IRGC commander, Mohsen Rezai, who has also stood in presidential elections in the past. He might try again. So as things stand, the image we get is that basically people close to Khamenei and with close ties to IRGC will probably stand. I'm sure they will allow some civilians also to stand just to give the semblance of some sort of competitive elections. But I very much doubt there will be anyone who will, who might cause surprises for the regime at this particular time, when because of economic sanctions, international isolation, the war in the Middle East and so on, the regime finds itself quite vulnerable, especially following the nationwide protest in 2022.
OK, I'm glad you've widened this out for us, because our next question concerns the political implications of Iran's internal political instability on the broader geopolitical dynamics in the Middle East, particularly regarding relations with Saudi Arabia and Israel. That's a question from Tyler Hess here at Ask DW.
I think Iran will continue its current course in terms of foreign policy, largely because foreign policy, as I mentioned earlier, is really determined, at least in its broad and basic outline, by the Supreme Leader and IRGC. And they have decided that one way of dealing with US pressure through economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation is to kind of undergo some sort of rapprochement with regional states with which they have had quite, unstable and tension-prone relations, especially Saudi Arabia. As your viewers might remember, China kind of mediated between Iran and Saudi Arabia, so relations have been normalized. And I doubt Iran wants to change that pattern at this particular time. Basically, Islamic Republic wants to continue its support for its proxy forces, which it describes as axis of resistance, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis in Yemen, without causing a direct and outright conflict with either United States or Israel. Now, maintaining this balance is difficult, but Iran has tried to do so, and Iran has been able to do so largely because the United States also wants to avoid a direct conflict with Iran, especially in the run-up to the presidential elections in the United States itself. But if in November elections in US, Donald Trump wins, he's known for his hard line against Iran, so that might change the equation quite significantly. So a lot depends on that elections, as well as the way in which the war in Gaza develops. If it spreads to Lebanon, for example, Iran is likely to back Hezbollah full force, and that also involves the danger of Iran being directly implicated in that conflict, and therefore a wider war might erupt. So in summary, I don't think Iran will change its foreign policy in a significant way just because President Raisi has died in this crash. But developments outside Iran might actually force Iran to also, update its policy in the region.
Okay, so likely no change in its relations, certainly with Israel, but likely with its near neighbours. How about looking further ahead? We've got another question here for you, Kamran Mateen from the University of Sussex. If their own house is in disorder, could Ebrahim Raisi's death, could this slow down or even stop the support Iran has been giving to Putin? That's from Philippe Bostopt.
I very much doubt so, because in a way, Islamic Republic in the last 44 or 5 years since its inception has fed on crisis. And when there is no crisis, actually, they try to manufacture one because it allows them to justify internal repression. It uses this external crises to rally people around the flag, if you like, stir up nationalist sentiments and so on. And because Iran is in this kind of impasse with the West over its nuclear project, and because of the sanctions, Iranian foreign policy has been strategically reoriented towards Russia and China, the two patrons of Islamic Republic. So in some ways, if you look at the war in Ukraine from Iranian perspective, the more the West is implicated and kind of bogged down in Ukraine because of its reliance on Western and EU support in its defense against Russian aggression, the less likely that the United States and the West would put, extra pressure on Iran or would contemplate, military solution, for example, to Iranian nuclear project and so on. So Iran does benefit from continuation of that war and potentially benefits from Russia's success in that war. So Iran would continue supporting Russia in any way it can, unless there is a, deal with the West over its nuclear project and a wider kind of deal over regional policies and regional issues. That is extremely unlikely with the current regime in Iran and in the foreseeable future. But, things can quickly change in authoritarian regimes. And Iranian state, while at the moment seems strong and stable, but it's extremely brittle because it doesn't have social support within Iran.
So, and on that point, is there any way of knowing where the public is on perhaps hoping for or expecting a change with a change of president? Or do they simply, in the Iranian context, know that they just have to deal with whatever it is they get?
Unfortunately, the latter is the case. And if you look at the record of people's participation in elections over the last decade or so, you will see that they kind of systematically and progressively diminish. So that means that people have lost hope in the institutions of the state and in the fact that traditional reformist versus hardliners kind of bad cop, good cop kind of situation is able to deliver anything to them economically or politically or socially even. I mean, in terms of women's rights, for example, and the protest against compulsory veiling, which erupted in 2022 and was arguably the most serious challenge to the Islamic Republic since 1979, was driven by the fact that the regime was unable and unwilling to compromise even on the on the social and cultural issues, let alone on the major political issues. So I predict a very low turnout in the elections, and that will just show that the regime has resigned to the fact that it has a small percentage of people supporting it, and only focuses on that percentage to be on the streets when it needs them. You know, for example, today in this funeral ceremony.
OK, so on a what's almost a final point then, we'll have 5 days of a funeral. We'll have an election sometime within the next 50 days. Give us something to look out for. What should we be looking out for in this interregnum, in this uncertain period?
I believe after the funeral is over, these ceremonies, these 5 days mourning, basically they open the election kind of campaign begins, and people begin to register for participation in it. Depending on which candidates are eventually approved to stand for the office, one could have a picture of what the regime is thinking, basically, and the characters of those individuals, their relations with the supreme leader and with IRGC, will tell us a lot about the likely course of the new presidency and the Islamic Republic over the next few years.
OK, so lots of the international community focusing its eyes on Iran over the next couple of months. Thanks very much, Kamran Mateen, for sharing your insights and experiences with us, and to our viewers, especially those who sent in questions. Thank you for your active participation. Thank you, Kamran. Ask DW is a platform for genuine dialogue and understanding. We'll look at the big issues of the day and talk to experts with you about them. Stay tuned. Up next on DW, we have our series Her, looking at the women turning their personal grief into action. Don't forget, you can get all the latest news and information around the clock on our website, dw.com. Thanks for joining us.